The Newsagents USA.
He is still saying he didn't lose the election. I would just ask that. Did he lose the 2020 election?
Tim, I'm focused on the future. Did Kamala Harris censor Americans from speaking their mind in the wake of the 2020 COVID situation?
That is a damning non-answer.
It's a damning non-answer for you to not talk about censorship.
Is that the first time in history that a vice presidential nominee has been unable to say who won the last election? This was the debate between Tim Walz and JD Vance last night, and we're going to tell you how it went.
But overwhelmingly, it was polite, which is not something that we can say about the two presidential debates that preceded it. It was courteous. It was as though politics had gone back a decade. But believe us, it really hasn't. Welcome to the Newsagents USA. It's John.
It's Emily. And at 2:00 our time this morning, the debate began. Everyone set their alarms, very excited. And it was honestly one of the calmest, least sort of aggressive, slightly, am I allowed to say this, boring encounters of this whole presidential run.
How are you expecting people to stay with the podcast for the next half an hour if you're going to say it was bloody tedious?
No, it was quite a big ask, I think, at 2 a.m, because essentially it was everything that we always dream of. It was full of content, it was full of policy, it was full of actual argument. But what it wasn't full of, frankly, was Donald Trump. There was nobody kind of wandering around the stage weirdly, kind of peering down people's ears. There was no one kind of going off on a riff about cats. There was nothing memorable that you would take away, I think, as an Insta or a TikTok soundbite. It was just two blokes who were actually, as you said, quite genial to each other.
They were quite genial, and they were also trying to introduce themselves to the American people. And I know it sounds a ridiculous thing to say when they are vice presidential kind of running mates on a ticket where they've seemed to have had a ton of publicity. But a huge number of Americans will be tuning in to JD Vance and Tim Walz for the first time and kind of trying to get to know these two Midwesterners. One from Ohio, one from Nebraska, although Walz is now the governor of Minnesota. And they were trying to be nice. And I think what Vance wanted to do was to put a bit of meat on the idea of Trump's kind of rampant populism, conservatism. And I think he actually sort of did that quite well. And Tim Walz was this reassuring everyman figure, the classic Midwesterner.
OK, so if you take where they were sitting in the polls, kind of before this debate happened, Vance had created an image around himself, which was, I think, deeply disliked. You know, his unfavourability ratings were higher, but he was better known. Walz was more liked but less known, if that makes sense. Vance, what do we know about Vance? He said all the childless cat stuff, he talked about a federal abortion ban, and then after Trump did his whole Springfield, they're eating your dog stuff, he went on and said we have to create narratives because that's the only way the media cover the story. So I think this was Vance trying to rehabilitate himself. And I've always said this, actually. He's quite a good debater. He's quite good in a confrontational situation. And he managed not to be that confrontational. He managed to look as if he was listening. He didn't interrupt. There was a bit of me, and this sounds weird, but bear with it. There's a bit of me that thinks Vance is genuinely, I mean, you know, he's a bit of a frat boy. He's a Yale guy. I think he is more at home with academics and Democrats that he can argue with than he probably is in the Rust Belt, talking to people who don't really trust him. And I think that's what you saw on the stage last night. He looked quite at home, whereas Walz, I think, looked nervous and jerky at the beginning.
He was nervous and jerky, certainly, at the start. I guess the point about was it dull? If you're getting up at 2:00 in the morning, you do want something to keep you awake and interested and alive. And maybe that
lived for the dogs and cats last time. I was like, I'm so happy I heard this go out live.
Exactly.
It will be a moment of my life I will never, ever forget.
But one of the principal issues in this campaign, and we'll come to the others as well, is about abortion and a woman's right to choose, her control over her own reproductive rights. And you know, Donald Trump has said, and Vance has said, it's important that states can decide. well, what about women being able to decide? And that was, I thought, where Walz was at his best last night.
There was a young woman named Amber Thurman. She happened to be in Georgia, a restrictive state. Because of that, she had to travel a long distance to North Carolina to try and get her care. Amber Thurman died in that journey back and forth. The fact of the matter is, how can we as a nation say that your life and your rights, as basic as the right to control your own body, is determined on geography? There's a very real change.
Walz was very strong on this. He learnt the names of the women that he wanted to name check. He got each of their stories out. And Vance, I think, would recognise and was recognising in that debate that they hadn't got the abortion argument right. Now, don't forget, he was asked if Donald Trump would want to introduce a federal ban on abortion. And Vance went on the airwaves a few weeks ago and said he wouldn't. And then he actually got sort of put back in his box by Trump, who said, oh, we've never talked about that. How does he know? Vance has been on record saying he wanted a national ban on abortion. And I think that will haunt him. And I think it is worth remembering that when he says he never said it. That is a straight lie. But he was trying to essentially find his way back into a part of the argument he knows their team are losing.
And what's so fascinating about that is, and we've said this before on this podcast, about how what a nightmare it is to be number two to Donald Trump, where you're second guessing what he might say next. Because during the debate, not before the debate, so that Vance has been given an alert and has a line to take, during the debate, Trump puts on Truth Social, everybody knows I would not support a federal abortion ban under any circumstances and would, in fact, veto it because it's up to the states to decide based on the will of the voters. So Trump finally comes out and says, I am against a federal abortion ban. So if the law comes passed and it lands on the president's desk for assent, he was going to veto it.
Yeah, but listen to that. You're kind of dodging missiles whilst you're live on stage. And I think this is the problem that Vance has, that they are both there, don't forget, as surrogates. It's not really about them. It's not really about their policies. They're there to speak for their leaders. Walz feels he can speak for Kamala because he knows what Kamala Harris thinks and says because she tells him. Vance doesn't seem to have that same relationship with Trump. He's always kept guessing. And in a way, I wonder if Vance was projecting himself to the American people. I wonder whether this was actually just about, whatever happens in the Trump race, he gets a chance to make his pitch to be a leader for another time. I don't know.
Trump has been trying to look both ways on this. He's Trump, for the great decisive man that he is. The one thing we know about Donald Trump is he is not a conviction politician. Convicted politician you can have, but not a conviction politician. He will blow where the wind is, and he suddenly realizes that he is losing again on the issue of abortion. And so during the debate, he announces, I will veto a federal abortion ban, which was kind of remarkable because obviously that becomes the story, anything rather than anything that JD Vance says during it.
Yeah. Another issue that came up was gun crime. I guess as you'd expect. And this is a curious one because don't forget, both the Democrats are gun owners, proud gun owners. Tim, Minnesota Nice Walz, describes how he keeps a gun in the car in the olden days so he could go and shoot pheasants. Kamala keeps telling us she's a great shot. She's got a gun too. Of the Republicans, we don't know about Vance, but Trump obviously isn't allowed to own a gun in several states because of his convictions. And so you do have that slightly weird interplay. But just have a listen to Walz talking about school shootings and JD Vance's response.
Governor, you previously opposed an assault weapons ban, but only later in your political career did you change your position. Why?
Yeah, I sat in that office with those Sandy Hook parents. I've become friends with school shooters. I've seen it. Look, the NRA, I was an NRA guy for a long time. They used to teach gun safety. I'm of an age where my shotgun was in my car so I could pheasant hunt after football practice. That's not where we live today.
But what do we do about the schools? What do we do to protect our kids? And I think the answer is, and I say this not loving the answer, because I don't want my kids to go to school in a school that feels unsafe or where there are visible signs of security. But I unfortunately think that we have to increase security in our schools. We have to make the doors lock better. We have to make the doors stronger. We've got to make the windows stronger. And of course, we've got to increase school resource officers, because the idea that we can magically wave a wand and take guns out of the hands of bad guys, it just doesn't fit with recent experience.
Now, look, the interesting thing about Vance at the beginning of that speech is he says, essentially, none of these answers are perfect. But the ones he really gives are definitely not perfect, which is like, how do you stop school shootings? Oh, let's lock the windows. Let's make the doors stronger. That is not an answer to gun shootings in American schools. I mean, it just cannot be the answer. And what he then starts to do is talk about Finland. I didn't see Finland coming. Did you see Finland
No,
coming?
I didn't have Finland on
so
my
he
bingo
talks about
card.
Finland. A lot of people have guns in Finland, but they're not mad and they don't all shoot each other. I mean, I think Canada's actually pretty much the same. But it was quite a strange one, that, because he was kind of opening the door to a debate on guns in some shape or form. And Walz then tells this horrible story about his son, who's 17, having witnessed a school shooting, I think on a baseball court or a basketball court. And Vance kind of goes, I'm so sorry about your son. I mean, that was the moment where I was kind of like, oh my God, you two, get a room. They were being very sweet to each other at that point.
I mean, spool forward to the very end of the debate.
Yeah.
And they stand and they shake hands and their wives come on stage and it all seems pretty convivial. And it's just a million miles from when Trump is there. And I just think that actually, for Republicans who hate Donald Trump, and there are a sizable chunk of Republicans who hate Donald Trump, to think that there might be someone sane on the ticket probably does Trump no harm at all. It probably does Trump an awful lot of good to think that there is a genial, decent guy who is the number two, and that might be the reassurance that gets them over the line.
And the worry for Walz is exactly that, which is why he reminds people why JD Vance is on the ticket, and that's because Mike Pence was in the bullseye of the January 6th rioters. They wanted to hang him.
He lost the election. This is not a debate. It's not anything anywhere other than in Donald Trump's world. Because look, when Mike Pence made that decision to certify that election, that's why Mike Pence isn't on this stage. What I'm concerned about is, where is the firewall with Donald Trump? Where is the firewall if he knows he could do anything, including taking an election, and his vice president's not going to stand to it? That's what we're asking you, America.
This is where we started the podcast.
Yeah.
When JD Vance said, I don't want to talk about the past. No, I bet you don't, JD Vance. I bet you don't, because it's very, very awkward to defend what happened on January the 6th. And the more you draw attention to it, the more you kind of highlight the extraordinary behaviour of Donald Trump after losing the election, having 60 court cases and losing all of them, and still insisting that you had won the election.
Yeah, because let's just remind people that Mike Pence refused to go with Donald Trump's narrative. He did certify Biden as the next president. JD Vance said when he got the nomination that he wouldn't have done that. He would not have certified the correct winner of the 2020 election. So the question for Walz last night that we played you at the very top was easy. Do you know if Donald Trump won or lost the election? And Vance just does this awful kind of primary school answer. Oh, let's not look backwards, let's look forward. If he wants to look forwards, I guess the question is, Donald Trump wants to pardon and free all those convicted rioters, all those people who tried to overturn the result of the election at the Capitol on that fateful day when people died on January the 6th. Do you support that?
There is only one answer. And yet he knows if he gives that answer, he falls out with Donald Trump. He falls foul of the MAGA crowd. And so he speaks with a forked tongue. He doesn't tell the truth about what happened on January the 6th. And he looks distinctly uncomfortable. And I thought that was kind of Walz's best moment. And it's, a moment for democracy, because, the election was won. And I also kind of think, it tells us a little bit about what is likely to unfold if it's a closely fought election.
This time round.
So
Walz's worst moment, and I think it's important that we probably bring you this as well, because it was sort of odd and scrappy, really, was when he was trying to explain about his time in China and Hong Kong. And he'd always said that he had been there over the Tiananmen uprisings, the protests, which were on the 4th of June 1989. And I remember this really clearly because the famous club in Hong Kong is called Club 64, which was the 6th month, the 4th of the thing. So we all remember that. He somehow said he'd been there when he actually hadn't even been in China and Hong Kong until August of that year. Now, maybe that's a mistake. Maybe it's a carelessness. Maybe he should have corrected it. It did happen a long time ago. But he got caught out on stage, which was not a great look last night.
You said you were in Hong Kong during the deadly Tiananmen Square protests in the spring of 1989. But Minnesota Public Radio and other media outlets are reporting that you actually didn't travel to Asia until...
He's asked that question, and then he talks for 2 minutes about having been in the National Guard, having been a teacher, having done everything, and you're thinking, hang on, you haven't even addressed the question yet. And then as part of some other project, he goes to China, and then the presenter has to come back and say, hang on, what about the question I just asked you? Did you or did you not? Were you or were you not there at the time of it? And this is what he ends up saying.
Governor, just to follow up on that, the question was, can you explain the discrepancy?
All I said on this was I got there that summer and misspoke on this. So I will just, that's what I've said.
Just say I got the month wrong, right? I mean, because the implication is it's a bit like us trying to pretend we were there when JFK was shot. You know, if you weren't...
You weren't born.
I wasn't born, right? So just say...
I was 4 and I was there. Yeah, I was on the grassy knoll.
Exactly, that grassy knoll, exactly. But just don't try and fudge something that is clearly provable otherwise. I think Hillary Clinton did it once. Do you remember?
Yeah, under fire, getting off a helicopter in Bosnia.
Exactly.
Yeah, and she hadn't been.
It just follows you around. There's no need for it.
Exactly.
It's a silly thing to say.
Yeah, it was a really silly thing to say. I also thought, I tell you, the other thing I thought that was interesting about that is that when Tim Walz says, I misspoke, okay, brackets, I told a porky.
Yeah.
I thought JD Vance was going to pounce and say, you can't trust a word this guy says, He absolutely didn't go there. It was like, I'm not going to get into personal
because
attacks.
most of the stuff that Walz says is more true than most of the stuff that Vance says. So you have to start off with this sort of asymmetry, which is that broadly, I think Walz doesn't lie about stuff as much as, Vance was literally saying that he'd never called for a federal ban on abortion when he's on tape saying it, right? And then he starts sort of talking about inventing narratives. I mean, we haven't given you the Springfield version of last night, and I think we do have to revisit Springfield, because this came up in the context of how Donald Trump's remarks had basically set off a round of attacks on legal immigrants, legal Haitian immigrants. And JD Vance tried to explain, and he actually sort of interrupted the moderators to say, well, they weren't really legal, they were only legal under a law. And the moderators were like, that makes them legal.
But he also complained. He also complained about the moderators. The rules are you're not meant to fact check me. Oh, really?
Yeah.
I mean, that's
don't
not a
say
great
that
look.
out loud.
That's not a great look, is it?
I thought I would get away with this if it hadn't been for those pesky kids.
I mean, you're an interviewer. You're not meant to challenge me. What are you thinking of?
Yeah, not great.
Just to clarify for our viewers, Springfield, Ohio does have a large number of Haitian migrants who have legal status, temporary protected status.
Well, Margaret, but
thank you, Senator. We have so much to get to.
Margaret, I think it's important because
we're going to turn out of the economy. Thank
Margaret,
you.
the rules were that you guys weren't going to fact check, and since you're fact checking me, I think it's important to say what's actually going on. So there's an application called the CBP.
Yeah. How disgraceful of Margaret Brennan to fact check him. I mean, what a disreputable thing for a journalist to do.
So this debate, like the last one, had no audience, and it had the ability to cut people's mics, right? So each of them were just told if they were rambling, they had their mics cut, which is something that we wish our producers hadn't learned about.
Well, I don't think Rory would dare to cut either of our mics
while
we're speaking.
When we're speaking, we're fine.
We get away with all sorts of things. He wouldn't do it. He wouldn't do it because he would be fired.
So obviously, the backdrop to this debate was what had unfolded just a few hours earlier in Israel with Iran's ballistic missile attack, and the sense that, we are really in an international crisis. So it was impossible for the debate to ignore that as a kind of setting for what the next president is going to have to contend with when they go to the Oval Office in January 2025. And Vance was very much on the attack about Kamala's role in facilitating, he almost says, Iran to be able to launch this attack on Israel.
The U.S. did have a diplomatic deal with Iran to temporarily pause parts of its nuclear program, and President Trump did exit that deal. He recently said, just 5 days ago, the U.S. must now make a diplomatic deal with Iran because the consequences are impossible. Did he make a mistake? You have 1 minute.
Well, first of all, Margaret, diplomacy is not a dirty word, but I think that's something that Governor Walz just said is quite extraordinary. You yourself just said Iran is as close to a nuclear weapon today as they have ever been. And Governor Walz, you blame Donald Trump, who has been the vice president for the last 3.5 years. And the answer is your running mate, not mine. Donald Trump consistently made the world more secure. Now,
is the hub of the argument, I guess, is that Obama sorted out the Iran deal because he thought you bring them into the tent, you make them feel that nuclear facilities are okay as long as it's used for, heating and energy and all the rest of it. You basically declaw them. Trump comes in and says, what are you doing? What are you talking about? Iran will always be America's enemy. You get out of the deal, you send them packing, and Iran is our proper enemy. And I guess, the counterfactual is we can't possibly know if we'd stayed in the Iran deal, but with this Iranian leadership, would the world now be a safer place, right? Yeah. Would we all be getting on or not? And so I guess the argument each of them makes is Walz says, of course, we should have had, more reciprocal understanding of Iran. And Walz is making the case that actually the world was much safer when the Iran deal was there, that Iran was on side, essentially. And Vance will make this continual statement that Trump scared enemies into not responding, hence no war. Now, I mean, it's impossible to say, isn't it? He cozied up to Putin. He let Putin do whatever he wanted. So did Putin not invade Ukraine because Trump was in power? I don't think we know that.
Well, the thing about the Iran nuclear deal was that nuclear inspectors were going in on a regular basis and to check that whether, uranium was being enriched to the weapons grade level or whatever. And that stops. Now, what Trump was able to do was to say, right, we're turning off the taps of money that is going to Iran. We're going to reimpose sanctions. We're going to cripple them economically. Well, it doesn't seem to have had much effect. But what you have got is the potential that for the past 2, 3, 4 years, Iran has been continuing to enrich uranium at its bases, and how much closer it's got to developing a nuclear weapon, we do not know.
So this is the worst possible combination, because you're not in the Iran deal and you're not scaring them, as Trump would say when he was in power. So in a way, Vance does win this point, which is that 3 years on, I think, he can turn round to the Biden-Harris administration and say, well, how did you let this happen on your watch?
And also, what he did do was to say October the 7th happened when Kamala Harris was in the Situation Room, and really pinning kind of the responsibility. Again, another counterfactual. If Trump had been the president, a strong president, this would never have happened. Hamas wouldn't dare to have launched their attack on Israel. And that's, another attack where you can't prove or disprove it either way. And that works to his advantage.
And this was Kamala Harris speaking after the debate.
So today, Iran launched approximately 200 ballistic missiles at Israel in a reckless and brazen attack. I condemn this attack unequivocally. I'm clear-eyed. Iran is a destabilizing, dangerous force in the Middle East, and today's attack on Israel only further demonstrates that fact. Earlier today, I was in the Situation Room with President Biden and our national security team as we monitored the attack in real time and ensured that the protection of U.S. personnel in the region is paramount.
One of the questions I think I've got is why it's Harris now rather than Biden. I mean, is she doing all the talking for both of them now? Is this part of her campaign, or is it part of that administration?
Well, it's a really interesting question. I think that the vice president would typically always be in the Situation Room.
Yeah.
But you wouldn't typically get the vice president talking about what was happening.
Right.
But because Kamala Harris is the candidate, she is the one that is doing the talking on behalf of the administration. But I do think it speaks to there being a kind of a gulf, a chasm, a vacuum at the moment in American leadership? Because, yeah, Joe Biden's the president, but he's not running again. How much notice does Netanyahu take, or how much notice does Iran take of the saber rattling that might come from America, given the uncertainty of the period that we're in? And, we said at the top of this podcast that, it was a bit dull, it was a bit too genial, it was, I don't think it changes the terms of trade of the election, which is that the polls show this election to be on an absolute knife edge and unbelievably tight. And you wonder whether, people talk in US politics about the October surprise, the thing that will kind of change,
throw it off its
course. And you wonder whether this might be the thing, that something happens over the next 4 weeks, Israel, Iran, American response to it, that suddenly kind of alters the kaleidoscope.
And I guess the question then is, does Trump get in because people believe the narrative that he wasn't involved in any foreign wars when he was president? Or do they just think, oh my God, like the last thing we need is a hot-headed maniac? We cannot risk that. We don't want somebody who keeps talking about Kim Jong-un and nuclear buttons and all the rest of it. Like, the last thing we need is somebody who is as potentially explosive as Trump.
Well, let us hear from Donald Trump, because he was speaking in Wisconsin last night.
For certain reasons, I think they probably would have been there too. It would have been peace in the Middle East. Instead, this is just tearing it apart. This has really been bad. But they have to finish that process. However it turns out, they have to finish the process. This is a little bit like two kids fighting in the schoolyard. Sometimes you have to just sort of let it go a little bit, and we'll see what happens. But it's really caused by a lack of respect for the United States of America. This would have never happened. Israel would have never happened. October 7th never would have happened. Russia never would have invaded Ukraine, and for 4 years they didn't.
Look, the politics of it are sane in the sense that he says none of this happened on my watch. Fair enough. But, the idea that everyone was too terrified because Donald Trump was in charge, I'm going to say I don't think Vladimir Putin was that scared of Donald Trump, more the other way round.
I totally agree, but I think it is still quite a convincing narrative. It's the thing that we're always warned about, which is like you can have a correlation without any causation. Exactly. And Donald Trump's just going in there and going, no, it was all me. It was all because of me. And I think it is quite a compelling thing for an America that feels scared now. I do think that this will be a good narrative for Vance to push. Right? Remember those days? Remember those days of no foreign wars? I mean, there's a lot of weird stuff that goes on. I mean, one of the lines that Vance tried to push was that because of Trump, the Affordable Care Act under Obama was saved. Now, Trump was the guy who kept on saying he wanted to get rid of it. It was his main day one thing. I'm going to get rid of that terrible, Obamacare. I hate Obamacare.
But for John McCain standing up and putting the thumbs down.
Exactly. So Trump was always the one that didn't want to get rid of it, but actually, 9 years on, whatever, has not replaced it, has not made anything more than, what was that lovely phrase? A conception of a plan. There are a lot of things that are absolutely untrue that poor JD Vance has to kind of talk his way through. But that one on foreign policy, I think, is easier than most for him to sell.
The thing is that we always say that US elections are decided by US matters, the state of the US economy, immigration, the border, abortion, whatever it happens to be, gun control. I just wonder whether, this time round, as in 1980 with Jimmy Carter, when there were the Iranian hostages in, US hostages in Iran, that again has Iranian a decisive effect. The US hostages in Iran, that again becomes the decisive factor in a US presidential election.
If you need the film of the moment, Argo.
Fantastic.
Argo, right? That's the film of the US hostages in Iran. Very worth watching. But I think you're right. The point about this is it's not about what our position is vis-a-vis those foreign wars, if you're American. It's, do we want our money spent there? And that has been the thing that has got, Zelensky so worried in Ukraine. Americans saying, oh, I'm not sure I like our tax money going to Ukraine. I'm not sure I want to see our tax money going, to the Middle East to help fund wars that we don't want. That's, I think, where Americans suddenly start thinking it is a domestic issue, not a foreign issue.
We're now going to go down memory lane and pick our favourite vice presidential candidates and why.
Go on, you go first.
Oh, God. I'm going to choose Walter Mondale, who was Carter's, happy birthday, Jimmy, 100 this week, congratulations, who was Carter's vice president. And he was the one who really challenged the idea that being the VP isn't worth a barrel of warm piss, which is the kind of famous phrase that was used before.
My VP, you're the solution to my problem. I'm CEO of a large company. I have been Secretary of Defense. I have been Chief of Staff. The Vice Presidency is mostly a symbolic job. Right. I can see how that wouldn't be enticing to you.
Because Walter Mondale came along and said, you know what we need to do? If I'm going to be your vice president, this is how it will work. These are the responsibilities I want to have. I want to be involved in national security decisions. And he sort of codified the role of vice president, which it had never been done before. And for that reason, I think he was a really significant vice president. That was a really boring answer.
No, it was good. But remember, I mean, he was the one who suffered the ultimate put down when he went for the presidency up against Reagan. And he was the first one to try and call out Reagan's age, doing the Biden thing that has been done many years later. And Reagan turns around and says to him,
I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience.
Kind of finished him off, at least on the debate stage. My favourite, I think, just has to be Sarah Palin. I knew you'd go there. It was such an electrifying moment. It was the 2008 election that Barack Obama pretty much had nailed down. John McCain was looking a little bit too sort of old and white and crusty, quite frankly. And clearly his team had said to him, you've got to go out and find somebody who, energises you or makes you look young or gets you the women or stops Obama winning. And so he's kind of looked around this is a very conservative military man who kind of ends up with this brash, extraordinary Tea Party crazy woman, Sarah Palin, who then comes into the team. I mean, I'd love to have been the fly on the wall of their chats. It's sort of Charles and Diana. Like they could not have been.
But Tina Fey on Saturday Night Live just brought Sarah Palin to life.
An amazing time we live in. To think that just 2 years ago I was a small town mayor of Alaska's crystal meth capital. And now I am just one heartbeat away from being president of the United States. It just goes to show that anyone can be president. Anyone.
I mean, she was just
I don't think
gift.
you needed Tina Fey. I mean, Sarah Palin brought Sarah Palin to life because every single interview she did was just like, hold my beer. I just want to watch this. It was, they crashed and burned at the end and Obama sailed to victory and the rest is history. But she's only she was at that time, the second female VP candidate. Neither of them got it.
We'll be back next week. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.
Bye.
The Newsagents USA.